Hi everyone, I am not here with you in class today, so I wanted to record a video so that we could still do the activity about the Battle of Little Bighorn and still go through today's lesson, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit about just the history of the Battle of Little Bighorn and how, if you look at it from a different perspective, you might hear a different story. So let's start with what you need. You should have picked up this chart from the front of the classroom. It says Perspectives Matter, the Battle of Little Bighorn, and there are 3 rows here for the 3 different perspectives or the 3 different points of view we will read today. And you can see at the bottom it's got this final response where you will reflect on what you've learned. So make sure you get that before you continue. So like I said, this lesson will go over the Battle of Little Bighorn and why perspective matters. So to start with, let's get a little bit of background about this particular event. This video comes from the History Channel, and it will just set us up for understanding a little bit more about this event.
It's one of the most crushing defeats in American history. Custer's last stand. June 25th, 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and over 600 troopers of the 7th United States Cavalry arrive in the Little Bighorn Valley of southern Montana. The cavalry has come to subdue a village of defiant Indians. Thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne under the leadership of the great holy man, Sitting Bull. For a century, the United States has pushed the frontier west, herding tribe after tribe onto agencies or reservations. The Sioux and the Cheyenne don't want to give up their land on the northern plains. These last defiant Indians gather into a colossal wandering village. In the spring of 1876, the village arrives on the plains of Montana.
The village was always on the move. They knew the army was out after them. And to the United States Army, to capture a fleeing village was an impossible task.
Custer follows Sitting Bull's path west across the Wolf Mountains. On the other side, the Indian village stands on the banks of a slender river. The Indians call it the Greasy Grass. The Army calls it the Little Bighorn. On the morning of June 25th, Custer and his troops arrive in a treacherous landscape carved up into hidden channels and ravines. Perfect cover for fighters who know its contours. Deadly for the soldiers who don't. Around noon, Custer makes what many believe is his fatal mistake. He divides his forces into 3 separate columns. Custer heads up the bluffs along the river to attack from the north. It's his first clear look at the size of the village. He realizes he doesn't have enough troops to do the job. He sends a rider south with a note calling for more men and more ammo.
It's important to keep in mind that no one had any idea of how many Indians there would be. They simply had no idea.
Indians are surrounding Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his battalion. Survivors are struggling to join up with other troopers on nearby high ground. A spot now called Last Stand Hill.
The tables are turning for Custer. He's no longer the attacker, he's being attacked. Decides to take this high hill, which we call Last Stand Hill today. All the soldiers killed their horses to hide behind. One of the warriors said was they got close to this hill, they arched their arrows high into the sky, having those arrows come down behind those dead horses. They said, we rained arrows down on those men. Their shots quit coming, and we rushed up and we killed them all.
Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and over 200 of his men annihilated in a defeat that devastated America in 1876.
This battle, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, was the Plains Indians' greatest victory. This caused the government to send out more forces, more military.
Less than a year after the battle, Sitting Bull flees to Canada, and Crazy Horse surrenders in Nebraska. The Last Stand has been studied more closely than almost any military engagement in our history. Today, the battlefield still lies serene and empty. above the cottonwood trees lining the Little Bighorn River.
So that gives us a little bit of background on the Battle of Little Bighorn. This will give us a little bit more understanding of our geography before we get into our filling out our chart. So you can see on this particular map, there are battles that are symbolized by this little explosion symbol, and then there are US Army forts with this little square symbol. And so you can see that there are lots of battles taking place in the mid to late 1800s out here, out in the Great Plains. And we already know that this is a consequence of the United States pushing settlement out into the Great Plains and settlers coming in and settling, and also the government's push to move Native people onto plots of land to be stationary through the Dawes Act, and the Native people resisting the push to stay on stationary plots of land. And so one of those consequences was the Battle of Little Bighorn, and you can see that located here on the map. And so let's just build a little bit more background. We can see this is a diagram that shows that particular battle. You can see the encampment here, and on the video they mentioned that this was a really large population, a really large group of Native people that were moving together and camping together, and you can see Custer and his men are moving along as if to do some kind of sneak attack here, but Custer and his men do not know the land as well as the people who are encamped down here. And so as the video revealed, it's going to be a very poor strategy on the part of General Custer and his men. So let's just really briefly look at this picture, and this is going to set us up for thinking about perspective. So you haven't hopefully filled anything out on your chart yet. We're going to get to that. But you can see on this picture, we've got this object here at the center, and you notice it just depends on which angle you're looking at this object. If we're looking at the object from this angle over here from the right, the object's going to appear round, and you can even see that reflected onto the wall. If we're looking at this object from this side and we're looking directly, just straight forward at this object, it might appear square. Just because we're not getting that full picture, we're only seeing one side of this three-dimensional object. And so this object might appear square if I only saw this angle. This object might appear round if I only saw this angle. And so what we're going to look at as students of history is that if we look at an event from one angle, it might appear different than if we looked at it from another. And so as historians, especially when we're looking at primary source documents, it's so important to look at different perspectives to get a better picture of what really happened. So now is when you need to get out your chart. So this is the chart you're going to be writing in. Make sure that every time we look at a source, you're going to put down the name of that source so we know where you're getting your information. You're going to be collecting facts and details about each source, what they say about the Native people. How does that source describe the Native people? You'll put facts in this box. How does this source describe General Custer and his men in this box? And how does this source describe the conflict? What are some facts or what are some details that this source gives us to understand the conflict a little bit better? So this is our first source. You can call this document A, the Cameron Report. And just to understand this source a little bit better, we can see at the bottom it gives us a little bit of information. It says that this source was the president, you can see over here, President Ulysses S. Grant, had asked the Secretary of War, this man over here, J.D. Cameron, for a report of the military actions that were leading up to the Battle of Little Bighorn. So the Battle of Little Bighorn took place, and Ulysses S. Grant it's building up to this point, and he's wanting to get more information to understand what is happening out in the plains, what's going on, and he asks his Secretary of War, J.D. Cameron, give me a report of what's going on out there. And so you can see here, this helps us see where the Lakota Sioux were living at that time period, and we know it's going to take place somewhere up here. So you need to be collecting facts about what this document tells us about Native people. What does this document tell us about Custer and his men, and what does this tell us about the conflict? And of course, this is going to come from the perspective of J.D. Cameron, a government official. So it says, to the President, Washington, July 8th, 1876. There have been certain wild and hostile bands of Sioux Indians in Dakota and Montana. I refer to Sitting Bull's band and other bands of the Sioux Nation. These Indians continue to rove at pleasure, attacking scattered settlements, stealing horses and cattle, and murdering peaceful settlers and travelers. The present military operations are not against the Sioux Nation at all, but against certain hostile bands that defy the government. No part of these operations are on or near Sioux Reservation. The accidental discovery of gold on the western border of the Sioux Reservation and the settlement of our people there have not caused this war. The young Indian warriors love war and frequently leave the reservation to go on the hunt or war path. The object of these military operations was in the interest of the peaceful people of the Sioux Nation, and not one of these peaceful Indians have been bothered by the military authorities. Respectfully, J.D. Cameron, Secretary of War. So I want you to take a second, even pause the video, and go back and find some details about how this document portrays the Native people, General Custer and his men, and the conflict. So our next primary source comes from an interview, and this interview is with Kate Bighead. It actually is Kate. I think it says Katie up here, but her name is Kate Bighead, and she was interviewed by a historian. You can see at the bottom, Kate Bighead was a Cheyenne Indian, and she told her story to Dr. Thomas Marquise in 1922. So decades later, Dr. Marquise was a historian who was trying to understand the Battle of Little Bighorn, and he was interviewing people who had accounts of that event. And so this is what Kate Bighead told Dr. Marquise. This is what she said. Little Bighorn was not the first meeting between the Cheyenne and Longhair. She called General Custer Longhair. Early in the winter of 1868, Longhair and the 7th Cavalry attacked our camp on the Washita River, killing Chief Black Kettle and his band, burning their teepees and destroying all their food and belongings. In the spring, Longhair promised peace and moved the Cheyenne onto a reservation. When gold was discovered, white people came and the Indians were moved again. My brothers and I left for the open plains where our band of Cheyenne was again attacked by white soldiers in the winter of 1875. We were forced to seek help from a tribe of Sioux. We joined Sitting Bull and the Sioux and decided to travel and hunt together in one strong group. As conditions on the reservations became worse, more and more Indians moved west, joining our group. 6 tribes lived peacefully for several months, hunting buffalo, curing the meat for winter months, and tanning buffalo hides. In the early summer, 1876, we set up camp near Little Bighorn River. Soldiers were spotted by some hunters to the south of the camp. So go ahead and pause the video and write down some details about how this particular perspective describes the Native people, General Custer and his men, and the buildup of this conflict. Lastly is a textbook account, and so this is a secondary source. This was written in 2006. This was written by people who are now trying to describe it later, and so they have a perspective too. They are teaching students, and they also have a purpose, and so take what they say and write down their perspective on these 3 categories. For years, the Lakota Sioux conducted raids against white settlers who had moved into Sioux lands. In response, the U.S. government ordered all Lakota Sioux to return to their reservation by January 31st, 1876. They refused. The situation was turned over to the military. About 2,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered near the Little Bighorn River. The leader of the Sioux, Sitting Bull, conducted a ceremonial sun dance. He reportedly had a vision of great victory over soldiers. The brash leader of the U.S. Army troops, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, predicted victory as well. On June 25, 1876, Custer led his troops into a headlong attack against superior numbers. Custer and his troops were quickly encircled and slaughtered. The Battle of Little Bighorn was a tremendous victory for the Sioux, but a temporary one. Now the U.S. government was even more determined to put down the Indian threat to settlers. So perspective matters, and it's important as students of history that we're looking at all points of view. Before you end today, can you go to the final response on your page, and can you use what you learned to tell the story from all points of view?